What does it take to build a workplace where employees feel safe, respected, and empowered? How do we, as leaders, navigate the complexities of employer-employee relationships while fostering a culture of trust and accountability? And how can we challenge traditional HR systems to create environments where everyone can thrive? Today, we are digging deep into these critical questions with our special guest, David Dilger. David is the co-founder of Edge Legal, a firm dedicated to reimagining workplace relationships by bridging the gap between compliance and compassion. Whether you're a HR professional, a team leader, or simply someone passionate about better workplace cultures, this conversation is packed with actionable wisdom you won't want to miss. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project. I'm greatly honoured today to be joined by David Dilger. David is the co-founder of an organisation called Edge Legal, and they look to empower employer and employee relationships by challenging traditional and sometimes very rigid HR systems to create amazing cultures and amazing workplaces where people don't fear any kind of legal ramifications, where people can create an amazing workplace where people fall in love with their jobs again. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. I don't really know fully where it's going to go. It's going to be a great exploration of what it means and why is a lawyer talking to us today about industrial relations and human relations. This is going to be really interesting. So David, without any further ado, I'd love it if you would say hello to the audience. I'd love to hear a little bit of a flavour of your background and what inspired you to do the work that you do today.
Well, g'day, Nick, and g'day, everyone. Look, I started out my time as a lawyer. I then moved into an employer organisation where I was training employers how to comply with legislation. And then eventually I went out and worked for one of my clients as an HR manager. And from there I went into some sort of higher national roles in HR positions, in telecommunications and heavy manufacturing. And then ultimately I went into a bakery franchise where I was the national HR manager and ultimately became the CEO of that organisation. From there, I then moved back into the employer organisation where I headed up the workplace relations function. And then from there, I went back into law where I was a partner of a law firm with about 100 employees. But really where Edge Legal took off was when myself and my co-founder decided to go out on our own and form a boutique employment and safety firm. And really our core mission and our sole reason for being Edge Legal is that we wanted to train and advise managers so that they could be the type of managers our kids would like to work for. We'd spent a hell of a lot of time in, convoluted, expensive, time-consuming court cases, and we just thought there has to be a better way. You don't win by winning a court case, but you certainly win by learning the lessons on how to treat people better.
Yeah, I love it, David. I love this mission statement you got, thinking about creating leaders that you would be happy for your kids to work with, the ones that you would want them to be leading. What's interesting in what I'm hearing, though, is when you talk about these legal cases, you end up in these situations where you get two parties that have somehow diverted. They've gone in completely different directions. And I have a view, David, that no one ever turns up to work thinking, I'm going to be a jerk today. I'm going to be horrible to everyone around me, etc. So whether it's the leader or the people manager that is making mistakes and creating the life hell for the employee, or the employee that somehow goes off the rails, they didn't really intend to do that. Where do we go wrong? Where do we get into the situation where two parties that really have the same interest in mind, they just want a good workplace, they want to get the job done, somehow end up in a fracas like this?
Well, I think it all comes down to self-awareness. Aristotle, way back when, said it best when he said that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And I think we've got a better message even from Simon Sinek, who said, if you don't understand people, you don't understand business, because we're complex individuals, us humans, and we see things not as they are, but as we are. So if you're just focusing on yourself, and we tell a story and we're always the hero and someone else is always the villain. And so what you end up on when people don't truly understand themselves, they can't manage someone else because they're focusing on their outcomes and what they would like. And, again, a great maxim is that the platinum rule is better than the golden rule, because the platinum rule says treat others the way they would like to be treated. That's the key. So ultimately it comes down to just that self-awareness to start with.
Yeah, so there's a lot of key takeaways there, David. And first of all, I agree. I fully agree that all businesses are people businesses. And if you don't understand people, you don't understand business. Fully agree with this. Second one is the self-awareness. I'm going to circle back to that in a moment. And then the third one here about really connecting with people and realizing that it is people at the end of the day that we're dealing with. Let's get into this self-awareness. So we do have this situation where we have leaders that go partway through their career thinking, I'm the greatest boss ever, right? They do lose sight of where their strengths and weaknesses are. And that if we're lucky, they might, by the way, I feel a bit guilty. I'm guilty as charged on this one in my own career. Later in the career, they might discover where they went wrong and to realize, oh, wow, it wasn't where leadership needs to be. And to bring to your point about the platinum rule, they hadn't taken the time to understand what other people wanted to treat them the way they want to be treated. So they might have got stuck on the golden rule, treating people the way I want to be treated, but everyone's different. And if we don't take the time to get to know people, we can't possibly treat them the way they want to be treated. So my challenge here is, if we have someone, and people might be listening to this show right now, where they have leaders in their business, where they've picked up a lack of self-awareness, how do we get someone to take a step back and look at themselves from the outside and have that moment of reflection to realize that maybe they're not doing as good as they think they're doing?
Well, I always ask this question, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? Because Bob Sutton from Stanford has got some great analysis from an anthropological point of view. And he says, your team's watching you about 8 more times than you think they are. So that magnifies whatever we're doing right exponentially, but also the other way if you're doing things wrong. And I think there's 4 types of leader, and I've characterized them into some fun animal sort of styles. The first one's what I call the bear manager. And the bear manager is called the bear manager because they basically hibernate from people management for about 6 months a year. And then when they come out, they ravage absolutely everything. They're indiscriminate, and their blind spot is they don't bring people along. And in fact, under more pressure, they have a further lack of concern from others. But deep down, their genuine fear is a loss of control or power. I mean, what you tend to see is those sort of claims ending up in your bullying claim. You also have then what I call the dog manager, probably best explained by David Brent from The Office, who you might have seen. And he introduces himself to his new work subordinate as, think of me as a friend first, boss second, entertainer third. Now, the dog understands people because they love to be loved. But the issue is they're overly positive and they tend to be disorganized because they're trying to do all the fun stuff first. And their killer point, or their soft underbelly, is social rejection. So they would rather get things wrong than be socially disliked. And what that tends to end up is you find workplace cliques where you have the in-group or the out-group, and you end up with all sorts of sort of fandangled solutions to genuine HR problems, like people trying to do redundancies instead of having performance discussions. The third one is the mouse manager. And again, they understand people, but they're so avoidant in their behaviour that they would rather do the work themselves. So they get on the hamster wheel. Now, if you're the type of manager who at 10 o'clock at night is doing the work of one of your subordinates because you haven't been able to have a difficult conversation with them, you're more likely to be that mouse manager. And your typical sort of blind spot is you don't know your own needs and you actually focus more on the group. You're too obliging, and your soft underbelly is you just want things to remain the same. Now, the challenge with that is it's very good to build consensus, but what it doesn't do, it exhausts the discretionary effort of both yourself, leading to burnout, and others. And so what you tend to find with those types of managers, they tend to find people leaving when no one really says anything, but ultimately you have an unsatisfactory sort of team environment. And then finally you get to what I call the ostrich. Now, the ostrich sort of doesn't believe that people management is their job. They're heavily task focused. So what they tend to be is they struggle to see the bigger picture. When they're put under pressure, they can become overly critical and they can go really onto the details. They'll be a bit narky in it. But you've got to give them some break. Their soft underbelly is feeling incompetent. And so what we tend to see with those is long-winded compliance type processes to get a result. That's kind of where we end up. Now, the ultimate bit is you've got to be a bit of the bear, you've got to be a bit of the dog, you've got to be a bit of the mouse, and you've got to be a bit of the ostrich. You've got to get your cut through, you've got to bring people along, you've got to build consensus, and then you can have your plan and your compliance.
Yeah, I love it, David. I'll share with you what I'm taking away from that. First of all, I use a similar saying to what you started with, and I switch it into the home front. Do you want to be always right, or do you want to be married? It's a little bit like that. And leadership isn't about you. It's about your team and about empowering your team and creating that environment. It's really interesting what you said about the 8 times factor, and people do pick up more that they see than what they hear or what you tell them. So they're going to be looking at your behaviors and they observe. They're sitting there observing you the whole time. So you better be role modeling the behaviors that you want to see in others. And then when I hear you talking about the animals, I was privately processing, yeah, I know a type like that. I know a type like that. So I've worked for a bear for sure. I recognize myself a little bit in the dog. I'm a bit of a people pleaser and sometimes avoid challenging conversations. I've seen the mouse in action. If you want something done, you're better off doing it yourself. And sometimes they convince themselves that they're sheltering the team by doing it themselves. And then the ostrich, I think I've had all of them. But what I thought was beautiful was then the amalgam is to pick and choose and go, well, what attributes of the bear are positive attributes? What attributes of the dog are positive attributes? What attributes of the mouse? What attributes of the ostrich? And start building your own model of leadership of the values. Come back to your thing that you said at the start. What kind of leader would your kids be happy to follow? Well, you can build that model from the more positive attributes of the 4 animals. How does that sit with you?
It's exactly what it's all about, this self-awareness. The big challenge you've got, and Bob Sutton, again, he gave us some great things out of his book, Good Boss, Bad Boss. And he talks about what your team wants more than anything is for you to manage poor performers and poor performance. And once you start doing that, your team is actually, I talk about this often. If I went into a team right now and said, who don't you want to work with? Everybody in the team knows who that person is. It's kind of like the naughty kid in the classroom, right? Everyone knows who it is, but you just don't say their name. And if you're a parent, you hope it's not your kid. And if you're one of the kids, you hope you're not the naughty kid. But the reality is, Bob Sutton in a workplace calls those people toxic rock stars. And what he said is he looked at all the metadata and he said, we get addicted to the KPIs and the results that the toxic rock star is delivering. But he said, here's the kicker. You'll begin to plateau after a while and you'll never receive any further growth once that toxic rock star has embedded themselves into the organisation. But he said, be encouraged and emboldened. When you get rid of that toxic rock star, you'll suffer a little dip, but then, like the stock market, your performance and that of the team will rise up. And I have seen that over and over and over again. And I have so many times been witness to managers going, David, if only I would have done this 2 months, 2 weeks, 2 years ago, doesn't matter. It's always with the value of hindsight that when you finally made that decision, you won't regret dealing with poor performers or poor performance.
This is a topic we've covered a lot on the show, David, and I'll share some of the reflections from previous guests that we get the behaviour that we celebrate, we get the behaviour that we reward, but we also get the behaviour that we tolerate. And this is what you're talking about here. And it's not just the individual who gets emboldened and like if they get away with it once, they'll do it again and then again and again. But it's the impact on everyone else. And people will either go, well, if Jim got away with it, I can do it too. And before you know it, you've got more than one Jim. Or they get really incensed and they either quit and they disengage, or they really quit and they go, I'm out of here. I can't believe that this toxic rock star, they might be the best salesperson in the company, but their behaviors are not in line with the values of the group. It's so insidious on the culture, so insidious. What I want to put to you here is that usually started with something small that wasn't addressed early, and then it snowballed. How does that sit with you?
It's absolutely what always happens. And look, in my experience, although the court cases you see and are reported in materials, in newspapers, in news groups, in news feeds, all tend to be that bullying manager, overwhelmingly what I see is the avoidant behaviour of managers, and that is managers have become either overly fearful of getting it wrong, or we just haven't trained them well enough to actually do the mechanics of what it requires to manage poor performers and poor performance.
So I'd love to hear some practical tips on this one, David, because I think there is a little bit of avoidance. It's either avoidance of a conversation that's going to be uncomfortable, that's quite normal, or it could be all the way through to what we discussed in your introduction, is that they are scared that they'll get it wrong. They're scared that they'll get themselves in a constructive dismissal situation or an unfair dismissal situation. What tips can you give to people where they can address performance without the fear of the lawyer, I think is what you said, and when we were first talking to each other?
Yeah, look, so I'd say adopt these principles. The principles are characterise more behaviour as performance, balance competency and care, take reasonable management action in a reasonable manner, and always show cause before taking disciplinary action, particularly termination. And so let me unpack that for you. When you characterise behaviour as performance, I break it down into 3 buckets. There's performance, misconduct, or capacity. Now, what we tend to do is we focus on misconduct. So there's a breach of a policy, a breach of the code of conduct, a breach of our values. Instead, we should be focusing more of it on the performance. And to further break it down, I call performance, misconduct, and capacity aren't, won't, and can't. So the issue is, think of more issues of if you're a good enough manager, what you're saying is rather than, Mick, you've breached something, you're out of here, or I'm looking to at least build a case where I can terminate you, you're going, Mick, you suffered some performance slippage, but I'm a good enough manager to help you get to back up to the performance expectation. Because if you just go for the misconduct angle, your intensity's too high, you've pitched it too high too early, And basically, you've risen the white flag up that says, I, as a manager, don't reckon I can improve your performance. So that's the performance issue first. Balancing competency and care, we all tilt one way or another. But what I say is you're always on a seesaw. It's not one or the other. Balance it up depending on your circumstance. If you have a people first approach, you will swing on your seesaw, balancing that competency and care factors. So, for example, person you have who continually doesn't meet performance expectations, you might be high on the competency side. Now they've got a death in the family, some problems at home or something, you've got to rebalance it with the care. And you can't be going, oh no, but this is the way we always manage it. That's just a lack of self-awareness, and that takes the people out of it. The third bit is reasonable management action in a reasonable manner. Look, that's a well-trodden path in legal circles. All your law around bullying and your workers' comp is all based on that. But the Fair Work Commission's really onto that now, and they're sort of adjusting and going, we understand that reasonable management action doesn't have to be perfect. So stop aiming for perfect or going, oh, someone else would have done it another way. There's quite a lot of cases now where the Fair Work Commission is going, yes, I know Manager Dilger was a little bit exasperated and he might have sworn, but that didn't make it so unreasonable that it was actually unlawful. And then my final bit is always show cause. Show cause is actually giving that individual that last opportunity. So if you're heading along on a procedural sort of issue with an employee, ultimately you can wrap up and tie up a lot of loose threads by one final meeting where I go, look, this is where we've been. This is where we're going to head. I need to hear from you from the last time, and then genuinely assessing that. If more employers would do that, they would find that the second arm of unfair dismissals, which is the harsh, unjust, unreasonable factors, they would get a better result if they'd done a show cause process. Most of the times they're looking for a get out of jail free card, pardon the pun, but it's just they're looking for, I've got you, you can't escape, when really, if it's performance related, it should be, we've tried everything, we can't get you over the line, and it only has to be for a reasonable time.
Yeah, I'm taking lots of mental notes as we're going along there. There's lots of powerful tips there, David. I still come back to something we were saying before, that if we get in there early, we can recover a lot of these situations. So address that performance or that behavior issue nice and early with clarity, maybe using a framework like SBIA, the situation, behavior, impact, action, like bring them along for the journey with them. I loved what you said about the competence and care. And to me, I was listening to you going, well, get curious first. If there has been a slip in performance, ask them, what's going on? Are you okay? Like, show a bit of duty of care before you get into that. The reasonable action, I think that is where people get a little bit gun shy, but I like what you said. And I think if you can say to yourself, I made the best available decision based on the best available information that I had at the time, that you can then rationalize that. And then, the show cause, give them a chance. And the other thread I was picking up there, David, tell me whether I'm on the right track here or not, is document this as well. So you have a good record that if you do end up in the situation that none of us want to be in, but if you end up in that situation, that you do have a good record of conversation, whatever the case may be. So if you do have a judge that needs to look at it, that they've got something to look at. How does that sit in there?
Yeah, it's definitely what we hear all the time. But I'd say this to people, your warning letters look contrived, and the Fair Work Commission are made up of people with expertise who have seen all of this before. So the stock standard template warning letters look inauthentic, and they actually don't look like you're giving someone a fair go all round. So what I would say, and what we train our managers to do, is focus on one-on-one meetings with your employees. If you're not regularly meeting with your employee at least fortnightly or gold standard weekly, and just having a performance discussion with them about how they're going, you're not fed income on managing your people, and your results are going to be lottery type approach to this once or twice a year performance appraisal. Because what is authentic is something like a day book where you write stuff down. And I can guarantee you, in my involvement, and I've been in dealing with commission cases for nearly 30 years, what's really authentic is a manager bringing out a day book and it's got, had a discussion with Mick about being late. And people go, oh, but doesn't Mick have to sign it and all this? And the answer is no. Because if you've got a pattern of documenting, those authentic notes are more powerful, because then there'll be another discussion and another discussion. And these days, it shouldn't be a technology-free zone. So it could be photographing the notes. It could be an ongoing email trail. It could be a voice memo, something along that lines. As long as you can demonstrate some pattern of regularity and a process, that is going to be more powerful than trying to wait for what I see a lot of employers do, and that's 3 warning letters. And let's just dispel the myth. There never has been a rule of 3 strikes and you're out. It's case by case. And you would look, imagine if you'd met 52 times, that's just once a week, and people say, oh, David, I haven't got time. I've got 8 direct reports, and I say, meet with them for 15 minutes. It's, about 2 hours out of 38. What are you doing for the other 36? What could be more important than working on the performance of your team? Because that's the leverage model. That's how it works. Otherwise, what are you doing as a manager? Like, what is your role? Not to do the tasks. You're in control of people.
This comes back to something you were hinting at before, that there are some people that think, oh, this is on top of my job. Well, I have to say, if you're a people manager or a people leader, it is your job. It's not on top of your job. It is your job. So find the time. And if you get into a good intentional routine, it's no extra burden. You can tick a lot of the boxes that you need to for whether it's duty of care or any other responsibility, if you have those regular one-on-ones that you're talking about, David. I love what you said about the logbook or whatever you want to call it. I can see what you're talking about, that, when you get into these warning letters, it just looks like, if you're not careful, it'll look like constructive dismissal at that point. You had it out for me from the outset, so you started taking these formal letters instead of giving me a real chance. And then in terms of reasonable management action that you've spoken about before, well, a logbook with 52 entries sounds like reasonable management action to me.
I say to managers all the time, what do you reckon is happening with the relationship when you write a letter to the employee that says, hey, bring a support person or your union rep, and this could result in disciplinary action up to and including termination of your employment? Because again, there was a myth out there that unless I mentioned the word termination, I couldn't eventually terminate someone's employment, which is just complete a furphy. Ultimately, all that's doing at that very moment is really spooking your employee. And if we know everything we know about the amygdala, we know that when the amygdala is hit, and that's your reptilian part of your brain, okay, it senses danger, hazard, risk. When it senses that, your frontal cortex, kind of like your computer, your logic part of your brain, doesn't work or doesn't work as well. And here's what else happens. It results in your memories impacted, your logic is stopped or severely impacted, your immune system is actually compromised. And there was a study by the name of Kevin Gilmartin, Dr. Kevin Gilmartin in the US, and he's trying to work out why is it that police officers suffer all of the worst side effects, the suicides, the marriage breakdowns, the strokes, that type of thing, versus fire officers. He's going, they're both first responders. They've both got really stressful jobs. But he said, here's what happens. He goes, when your amygdala is just slowly ticking away and pumping cortisol so you can fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, ultimately, like the police officer, that's slowly killing you. Whereas the fire officer gets a spike, it deals with the fire, and then your body goes back into homeostasis and you actually cope with it. Now, imagine if you're in a workplace where all you see is your manager and you go, oh my gosh, here comes Mick again. Oh, here he comes. Oh no, where's Mick gone? Oh, he's gonna check up on me again. All that's happening in there is your amygdala is firing, your logic is stopped, and that's when your performance is biologically impacted. It's nothing about being a snowflake. It's biologically impacted, and that ruins performance.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You're giving me a lot to think about, and some of the myths that you're busting, they're beliefs I had. So I'm learning a lot from this discussion. I know our audience is going to as well. And I like what you're saying here about the fight, flight, or freeze. I mean, what are they going to do? They're going to start protecting themselves. They're going to dig their heels in. They're going to get combative themselves instead of working on the performance issue that's at hand. And you're going to be triggering them every day, every time they see you. Their hairs on the back of the neck are going to stick up, and they're going to go back into that mode again. And potentially all you've done is added fuel on the fire instead of reach the fire extinguisher. So yeah, it's really interesting.
I was going to say, one of the other interesting parts, and going back to our reasonable management action in a reasonable manner, is the superpower of civility, right? It's the way in which we do things. You can deliver, and Kim Scott talks about this in a book, Radical Candor. You can deliver, messages of, hey, Mick, you're not meeting my expectations here, without losing your cool or without spiking someone's amygdala because of the way in which you deal with it. And Harvard has done the study, and they've said, look, if you're looking for productivity, increase your civility. That'll give you your productivity, because what's happening is when you're lacking civility or uncivil to an individual, they're impacted. But what Harvard was able to demonstrate was those around that person are equally as impacted, and their productivity, their creativity is diminished as well. And I think this has been the best example, the National Health Service in the UK, when they're looking at, why do we muck up with in surgeries or our medical procedures? It wasn't because of a lack of training or the lack of equipment or anything else. The number one factor that they'd identified was a lack of civility. So now most of their work is focused on be civil, because, when you're on the operating table and I yell at the nursing staff for not doing something, everyone's impacted. The amygdala fires off, our logic stops, and mistakes happen. And that's happening in workplaces, not just in medical procedures.
Yeah, I love it, David. So yeah, let's bring some civility in. Let's find some common ground as well. I mean, rather than just challenge everything that they're doing, you might be able to find some common ground on things that you agree on, and then work from there. And to think about adding that with Kim's work and thinking about radical candor, which is not a license to be a jerk, by the way. It's the concept is to challenge directly, but care personally. So yeah, you do need to challenge it. You don't avoid the uncomfortable conversation, but you do it whilst you care personally about the person and care personally about the outcome. All right. So as mentioned, I want to take us to a slightly different one now, David. So when we started at the beginning, we said about creating that great environment. One of the things that you and I have spoken about before we hit record was psychosocial safety. And it is a term that's used a lot in the workplace right now. There's new legislation that has been released as well. It's a term that a lot of people are using, but not everyone fully understands. What's your definition of psychosocial safety?
My definition is pretty much, look, they talk about psychological safety, mental health, and psychosocial. I just think it's just mental health and emotional well-being in the workplace. And that can be on the design of our workplace, the environment, the equipment we use, and the interactions we have. All of that is your psychosocial safety. And look, I do a lot of training in this area, and people get hung up on what's the difference. Look, I don't have a problem with people when they say mental health. People say, "Oh, shouldn't you say mental ill health, David?" And I say, "Well, we all know what we're talking about." And I think that's the key. Once you start talking about it and normalizing it, I think that has reduced the stigma. Another interesting one we're talking about, though, is, we're trying to normalize this, but everyone has to be involved in it. So that means that you have what Tim Clark talks about, 4 main areas. Inclusion safety. People need to feel that they belong. We don't have to be best buddies with everyone, but as long as I kind of know what I sort of am involved in, whether it's my department, my bigger team, a couple of buddies, that's okay. Learner safety. It's okay to make mistakes. Every organisation says, "Oh, no, we love mistakes." And I often ask, well, really, do you? If I say my ultimate test is this: if you see an individual go into a manager's office, do you all secretly sit there and go, "Ooh, Mick's in trouble"? Or do you just think that would be a normal interaction? That's the test. That's when you'll know whether you're successful or not. Then you get contributor safety. And I love the message that John Buchanan, a former Australian cricket coach, said. Basically just said, look, to get a good team, all I've got to look is to the left and the right of me, and I go, is that person going to do their role to the best of their ability and do what I expect them to do? And if everyone does that, we'll be all okay. But if I'm sitting there going, oh, gosh, I've got to work with Mick again, or he goes, oh, David, I'll have to double check everything David does, we don't have contributor safety. We're actually starting to worry about that. And then our final bit is challenger safety, and that is, do you allow me to put my hand up and go wrong way, go back? Everyone talks about it, but I say ultimately if you're struggling with that, just flip it a bit. We all dislike the person who's the naysayer and's always got something wrong. But if you were in a meeting and you said, hey, Mick, we're going to do this project and I want you to find as many things like the bear traps or stuff that's going to get us. Imagine that when Mick comes up with 10, good on you, Mick, versus Mick's in there just going, oh, here we go again, that won't work. Of course people get upset with that. But you get those 4 things, you'll get psychosocial safety. And it's not linear. It's not linear. You get them in all different areas. Some things are more important than others at different times. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love it, David. So some reflections on there. On the inclusion safety for a moment, what I like to sometimes do when I think about inclusion, similar to what you just did with the challenger safety, is to think about what the opposite is. And the opposite is exclusion. And I think all of us can think of one time in our life that we didn't feel included, that we felt excluded. And it feels bloody awful, whether it was in the schoolyard or at university or there was an in crowd and you were not part of the in crowd. It feels bloody awful. And people spend up to 1/3 of their life in the workplace. So they don't deserve to feel excluded. And by the way, you're missing out. You're missing out on whatever gifts they've got to bring to the table. You're not creating the environment where that will come through as a contributor, the contributor safety. If they don't feel included, forget the contributor safety. Forget the learner safety if they don't feel included, because they're not going to try anything anyway. They're going to kind of disengage. And the challenger safety, we're richer for these conversations. If people can stick up their hand and say, hey, I'm not so sure about this. And I love what you said about inviting the feedback. Go, hey, here's my plan. Tell me 5 things that are wrong with it. And then we can fine tune it. Without that challenge, everyone's just going to go, yes, boss, yes, boss, yes, boss. And off you go. You'll make 5 mistakes. Yeah, love it. David, this has been an amazing conversation full of lots of insights. I've learned a lot from this session. You've debunked a number of myths for me. So it's been really enriching for me. And I know that the audience is going to find it very valuable as well. I'd like to now take us to our rapid round. So these are the same 4 questions that we ask all of our guests. So first of all, David Dilger, what's the one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you were 20?
I think the number one thing that I've learned time and time and time again is that you just have to understand people for what they are at their time and what they're experiencing. Like the people first approach means you've got to actually work what you're dealing with in front. The plan itself is a good idea until you get the people's personalities in it. And I sort of focus on that more than anything.
Wonderful, David. And we do have to learn that again and again because all people are different. So we need to remind ourselves. Really good. What's your favorite book?
I love Bob Sutton, either the American version, which is the no asshole rule, or in Australia, the good boss, bad boss. I think if everyone read that, you just learn so much. He's got a beautiful turn of phrase. He's got great stories. Bob Sutton, love it.
I love it. Okay. All right. Awesome. What's your favorite quote?
Well, my favourite quote is the Simon Sinek one that I started off. You know, if you don't understand people, you don't understand business, because quite often, I mean, I was an HR manager, and it was interesting when I was sort of developing, I got hit by a really important fact and it was brought up by the Australian Human Resources Institute. They said, why is it that when they're looking for the next CEO, they only look at the CFO and they don't look at the chief people person? And I thought, that is a bit crazy, isn't it? And it's not a numbers game. It's not formulaic. The actual methodology is all about people. And I'm really surprised how organisations haven't grasped onto that as much. So I love that quote. I think it's a ripper.
It's really powerful, David. Now, lastly, you've given us a lot of tips, a lot of frameworks, a lot of things for us to go and reflect on. If people would like to know more or they'd like to take advantage of your services, how do people find you?
Yeah, they can look me up on edgelegal.com.au or send me an email at ddilger, all one word, at edgelegal, all one word.com.au. We love doing training with your managers. We do legal stuff as well, but part of our our niche is working with your managers so that we can train them to be better managers. And we think you'll just get better people outcomes and you'll get better financial outcomes, and you just have a happier place to work, and that'll make us happy as well, because that's our mission.
Brilliant, David. I love your mission. I love the work that you're doing. I love the way that you're debunking some of the myths that we have. And I love where your mind is at about the workplaces that you're trying to create. It very much resonates with me. Thank you so much for your time today. I truly feel richer for this conversation, and thank you for your time and your wisdom.
Thanks for having me, Mick. I've really appreciated it.
So there you have it. What an incredible conversation with David Dilger. Today we explored the intersection of leadership, self-awareness, and legal frameworks to create workplaces where trust and respect are at the core. David reminded us of the power of clear communication and the importance of fostering psychological safety, not just for compliance, but for building thriving teams. As you reflect on this episode, I encourage you to consider, what small changes can you make today to create a more inclusive and engaging workplace? How can you, as a leader, set the tone for a culture of trust and safety? In the next episode, I'll be sharing my own personal reflections from this conversation with David. I'm going to be digging into, where do we go wrong? How is it that we have leaders and team members all turning up, wanting to do their very best work, and yet sometimes we fall into these areas where we have these toxic relationships, where things do fall apart, where you do end up needing legal advice? How do we avoid that in the first place? If you're getting great value from our content, we would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcast or your preferred podcast service. You can also subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel, where we bring you weekly video podcasts, curated videos, and our live stream shows, all designed to help you become the leader that you wish you always had.
Thank you for listening to The Leadership Project at mixbeers.com. A huge call out to Faris Sadek for his video editing of all of our video content, and to all of the team at TLP. Joanne Goes On, Gerald Calabo, and my amazing wife, Say Spears. I could not do this show without you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel, where we bring you interesting videos each and every week. And you can follow us on social, particularly on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Now, in the meantime, please do take care, look out for each other, and join us on this journey as we learn together and lead together.